Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? This one got requested by a listener, and it's kind of fascinating and creepy at the same time. We're going to unpack the whole world of mind games.
Ah, yeah, mind games,
Mm.
where I guess you could say psychology meets, well, not exactly strategy, but something close to it.
Right, and the sources they sent over are all over the place. We've got like relationship advice columns, then some serious stuff about narcissism and straight up manipulation tactics,
Yeah.
even a couple articles about competition, like in sports.
Makes sense though if you think about it. Whenever people really want to win something, the stakes are high. These mind game kind of things, they tend to pop up, even if we don't always realize it.
Okay, so before we get too far, let's define what we're even talking about here. Not like board games, obviously.
No, no, nothing like that. Mind games, really, it boils down to it's psychological manipulation, trying to mess with someone's head, basically. Not through like open and honest talk, but through these sneaky tactics.
So less about fun and games, more like, I don't know, psychological warfare. Is that too
Wow.
dramatic?
No, I think that's a good way to put it. Actually, one of the sources even used the term um, mind control, which is that's pretty intense, right? But I think it speaks to the intent behind these tactics.
Yeah.
It's about power. One person trying to have power over someone else, and often the person being manipulated, they don't even realize it's happening.
And this isn't like harmless teasing, right?
Yeah.
The sources were pretty clear that this stuff can seriously mess someone up.
Absolutely. We're talking about damage to self-esteem. Trust issues, anxiety could even lead to depression in some cases, not something to take lightly.
So if it's that harmful, why do people do it? Are they just mean? Or is
I
there...
mean, sometimes maybe, but from what I read, it's more complicated than that. A lot of it has to do with control. The person playing the mind games, a lot of times they're actually deeply insecure themselves. So they try to get power over other people as a way to, I guess, make up for that.
So it's less about them being like evil masterminds and more about their own issues, kind of projecting outwards.
Right, exactly. And you know what else this source has talked about? Trauma. Like sometimes the person doing the manipulating, they were actually a victim of manipulation themselves at some point. So it's kind of sad, but it becomes this cycle that repeats.
Wow, that's heavy. A victim turning into the manipulator
Yeah.
makes you think, huh? Actually, this brings up an interesting question for you, listener. Have you ever felt tempted to use these kind of tactics? Maybe when you were frustrated or felt insecure. I mean, I think we've all been there at some point.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's human to want to have, some influence. The important thing is recognizing when that crosses the line into manipulation and being aware of the harm it can cause.
Right, right. Okay, so let's say we want to like protect ourselves. How do we even KNOW when someone's playing us?
Well, a lot of these sources had like lists of common mind game tactics, which is helpful. But the thing is, you got to go beyond just knowing the definition. You got to understand what it actually looks like, in real life.
Okay, so let's do a quick rundown of some of the big ones. First, there's gaslighting, which is it's not just disagreeing, right?
Hmm.
It's making you doubt your own reality, like twisting things around to make you think you're the crazy one.
Yeah, and it can be so subtle. Like they plant these little seeds of doubt over time.
Ugh, yeah. Then there's the silent treatment. But not just like needing some quiet time. It's specifically using silence to punish you, to make you feel anxious.
Yeah, it's about control, creating that feeling of unease, like you're walking on eggshells.
Then we've got love bombing, which
Mhm.
is, okay, this one's tricky because it sounds nice, right? It's all that showering you with affection early on in a relationship.
The key is the intensity of it and the timing. It's not just being romantic. It's like, bam, all this adoration all at once. It's almost addictive.
And that makes it hard to see that it's actually a tactic, right?
Right. It's designed to sweep you off your feet so you're less likely to question things later on when the behavior changes.
Ugh. Okay. And then, of course, there are guilt trips. But the sources pointed out that it's not just someone saying they're disappointed. It's using guilt to basically control what you do.
Right, like making you feel responsible for their feelings or pressuring you into doing things that you don't really want to do.
Exactly. It can be so subtle, but it's all about making you feel like you're the one who have to make them feel better, even if it's at your own expense.
And one tactic I think we should definitely take a closer look at is triangulation.
Oh, that sounds complicated.
It's basically bringing in a third person to mess with the dynamic. Could be an ex, could be someone they're flirting with. The point is to make you jealous or insecure or like you have to compete for their attention.
Ooh, yeah, I've seen that one. It's like playing hard to get, but way more manipulative.
Exactly. It feeds their need for control and validation because now you're the one fighting for their attention.
Speaking of control,
Hmm.
we got to talk about narcissism. One source straight up called them experts at mind games.
Mm.
What's the connection there?
Well, remember, narcissists, they think they're like the most important person in the world. They need constant admiration, and they're often really good at manipulating people to get that.
So they see people as like tools to get what they want.
Yeah, kinda. Mind games are like their favorite tool, I guess. It lets them keep that big ego inflated, you know? They get to control others and get all the validation they crave.
And this isn't just in like romantic relationships,
Mhm.
right? It can be friendships, family, even work.
Anywhere there's a power dynamic, really.
So, listener, hopefully you're starting to see how common this stuff is. But like, what do we do about it? How do we actually fight back against these mind games?
Well, before we get into specific tactics, I think it's helpful to understand like the psychology behind it. Because once you get how these mind games work, you're better at spotting them and resisting.
Makes sense.
When you
So, Psychology 101, what makes these tactics so effective?
One big thing is this idea called cognitive dissonance. It's basically, it's that uncomfortable feeling we get when we have two beliefs that clash. Our brains hate inconsistency, so we try to fix it.
Okay, I remember that term from college, but how does that connect to mind games?
Manipulators are really good at creating those situations where you have that clash, you know? So let's say someone love bombs you at the start of a relationship. You're feeling super special, adored.
You're like, wow, this person totally gets me.
Exactly. Then suddenly they pull away, become critical, or start playing those hot and cold games we talked about. Now in your head, you've got this clash. The belief they care about you versus how they're acting.
And because our brains hate that, we scramble to make sense of it.
And the manipulator's hoping you'll make sense of it in a way that benefits them. So you start chasing their approval, making excuses for them, doubting yourself instead of seeing what they're doing.
It's like a trap, and our own brains kind of walk right into it.
Pretty much. And this ties into another psychology thing. Intermittent reinforcement. Think of like a slot machine. It doesn't pay out every time, but those random wins are what keep people hooked.
It's the unpredictability that makes it so addictive.
Yep. And manipulators do the same thing. They give you just enough good stuff, affection, validation, whatever, to keep you hopeful, but then they withdraw it, so you're always wanting more.
So it's like they're training us, like some kind of, I don't know, Pavlovian response, to seek their approval, even if it's mixed with bad stuff.
It's a powerful cycle, and it can be really tough to break free from.
Okay, so we're starting to see the mechanics behind all this. But before we get to how to defend ourselves, there are a couple more specific tactics I want to unpack a bit more.
All right, which ones are you thinking of?
Well, we briefly mentioned projection, but I don't think we really dug into it. What's the deal with that?
So projection is basically when the manipulator accuses you of the stuff they're doing.
Hold on, seriously. Like, they're being manipulative, but they say, I'm being manipulative.
It can be that obvious, yeah. Or it can be more subtle, like they might accuse you of being jealous or controlling or insecure, but those are actually their issues.
That's wild. Why would they even do that?
Couple reasons. First, it takes the heat off of them. Classic blame shifting.
Easier to point the finger than own up to it? But I feel like there's more to it than that.
There is. It's also a form of gaslighting, because if they can convince you that you're the problem, you're not going to question what they're doing.
So it's a double whammy. They get away with it and make you feel bad about yourself at the same time.
Bingo! Super effective way to stay in control and keep you off balance.
Okay, that one's going in my red flag file for sure. Now, there's one more we talked about earlier that I want to understand better.
Which one?
Triangulation. We know what it ACS, but why is it so powerful? What's the psychology there?
Okay, so triangulation. It taps into some really primal fears and insecurities. Bringing in that third person creates a sense of scarcity, like there's not enough attention to go around.
So it's like, if you don't step up your game, I'll find someone else who will.
Right, and it triggers that fear of abandonment, that need to be chosen. Even if logically we know it's a game, it's hard to fight those feelings.
And because it's so emotional, it's easy to get caught up in the drama and lose sight of what's really going on.
You might find yourself trying harder to please them or competing, or even like questioning your own worth, all of which is playing right into their hands.
Ugh. Okay, this whole thing is starting to feel like a masterclass in manipulation tactics. I'm getting a PhD in mind games over here.
Well, hopefully knowing about them will help you spot them and protect yourself.
Right, knowledge is power. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We know mind games can be bad in the moment, but what about the long-term effects? What happens when someone's dealing with this stuff constantly?
That's a really good question. It's something the sources mention, but I think it's worth talking about more.
Yeah, wait on us.
Well, one of the worst things about being exposed to mind games for a long time is it can really mess with your sense of self.
Because you're constantly second-guessing yourself, doubting your reality, questioning your judgment.
Exactly. You start to lose trust in your own intuition, your ability to tell what's real. And that makes you even more vulnerable, not just to that person, but to others as well.
So it's a vicious cycle. The more you get manipulated, the easier it is to get manipulated again.
That's right. And it can lead to other problems too. Anxiety, depression, even in some cases, PTSD.
PTSD. That seems intense. But I guess if you're constantly on edge, never knowing what to expect, always worrying about the next mind game.
It can be very traumatic. And what makes it worse is that the manipulator often doesn't see themselves as the problem at all. They might even play the victim, which just messes with your head even more.
Yeah, like we talked about with projection. It's like they twist the whole story to make it fit what they want.
Exactly. And that makes it even harder to break free.
Okay, so the theme here is definitely awareness.
Mm.
The more we know about these tactics, the better we can protect ourselves.
Absolutely. So, listener, let's get to the part I think you're really waiting for. What can you actually do to fight back?
Because knowing is half the battle. Right.
Yeah.
But taking action is where the real change happens.
Exactly. And it all starts with, you guessed it, self-awareness.
I know it sounds basic, but all the sources kept coming back to it, so it's got to be important.
It is. Because if you don't know your own patterns, your vulnerability is what makes you tick.
You're going to keep getting played.
Most likely. So, really think about it. What are your insecurities? What triggers you? What kind of mind games have you fallen for before?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good journal prompt. Get to know your weak spots so no one else can use them against you.
Exactly. Once you know yourself better, you can start building those boundaries.
Which is what everyone says, but how do you actually do that?
Boundaries aren't about being mean or aggressive. It's about communicating what you need and what your limits are in a clear and respectful way.
Like, hey, when you criticize how I look, it hurts my feelings. If you keep doing it, I'm going to have to walk away from this conversation. Something like that.
Perfect example. You stated your need to feel respected and the consequence if it's not met.
And consequences are important, right? A boundary without a consequence is just, I don't know, a suggestion.
Exactly. And those consequences gotta be something you're actually willing to do. No empty threats.
So no more, I'm leaving if you do that again, when you have zero intention of actually leaving.
Got it.
Yeah.
But what about when someone's like actively gaslighting you? In the moment, it's so hard to think straight. It is. That's where having some like pre-planned responses can be helpful. Think of them as mental scripts ready to go.
Ooh, I like that. Give us some examples.
Things like, I hear you, but my experience is different, or I need some time to process this, or even just, I'm not comfortable talking about this right now.
So it's not arguing, it's just stating your reality, firmly but calmly.
Exactly. It's a way to disengage without giving the manipulator more to work with.
I love that.
Yeah.
And listener, remember, this takes practice. Standing up to someone who's trying to control you, especially if you care about them, it's tough.
You're right. But each time you set a boundary, each time you assert your own reality, you're getting stronger.
And hopefully the manipulator gets the message.
Mm.
This isn't going to work on me anymore.
Hopefully. But sometimes, no matter what you do, some people are just committed to their mind games.
Yeah, that's true. And in those cases, there's really only one option left.
You're talking about walking away.
It's the hardest option, but sometimes it's the only way to protect yourself.
You're right. And it's not a sign of weakness, listener. It takes a lot of strength to walk away.
It's about taking back your power, prioritizing your well-being. You're not a pawn in their game.
Exactly. And by removing yourself from that toxic situation, you create space for healthier relationships.
And remember what we said earlier.
Yeah.
Sometimes the manipulator's behavior, it has nothing to do with you. They've got their own stuff going on, their own insecurities.
That's such a good point. It helps you detach and see things more clearly.
It's not about taking it personally. It's about taking care of yourself.
You got it.
Okay, wow. We've covered so much already. From the psychology of it all to the specific tactics, the short-term and long-term effects.
We even dipped our toes into the whole narcissism thing and how that ties in.
We did. But we're not done yet. Join us next time as we explore how these mind games show up in different parts of our lives. Relationships, friendships, families, even work. We'll unpack all of that and more.
So we've spent a good chunk of time kind of dissecting the whole mind game thing, the tactics, the damage it can do.
And we've started talking about how to fight back with all this self-awareness and boundary stuff.
Right, exactly. But I think now it's time to get even more specific. Like, let's look at how these mind games actually play out in different areas of our lives.
Because, let's be real, it's not just some abstract concept, right? This stuff happens in our relationships, with our families, at work.
Everywhere, yeah.
Huh?
And each situation has its own, its own quirks.
Okay, so let's start with what's probably on a lot of our listeners' minds. Romantic relationships. A lot of the sources we read were laser focused on this.
Makes sense, I guess. Romance, it's all about, intense feelings, which can make you more vulnerable to being manipulated.
Totally. And there were a bunch of tactics they highlighted that are especially common in this area. We talked about love bombing before, but then there's also that classic hot and cold behavior.
Yeah, that push and pull thing. 1 minute they're all over you, next minute they're distant.
It's like being on a roller coaster, never knowing which way it's going to go next.
Yeah. And that uncertainty, it can be kind of addictive, You keep chasing their approval, trying to figure out what you did wrong.
It's a game you can never win.
Exactly. And one of the sources even pointed out that this hot and cold thing, it can be used to create this unhealthy attachment style.
You mean where someone becomes totally dependent on their partner for validation?
Right. They're always seeking approval from the outside, which, gives the manipulator a lot of power.
And it's hard to break free because you're so used to needing that validation from them.
Yeah, it can be a tough cycle to break. The sources really stressed how important it is to spot these patterns early on. If you see someone consistently doing this hot and cold thing, that's a huge red flag.
Totally. Run for the hills.
Well, maybe not that drastic, but it's definitely a sign that they might not be capable of a healthy relationship.
Okay, so we've got hot and cold behavior. What else did the sources call out?
Well, this one's kind of a bummer, but criticism, put-downs.
Ugh. Yeah, no one likes that. But how is that manipulation? Isn't that just someone being mean?
Sometimes, yeah. But often there's a hidden agenda. They're using the criticism to chip away at your self-esteem, make you feel less confident.
So it's not about them genuinely wanting you to improve. It's about them wanting to control you.
Exactly. They might criticize your looks, your decisions, your accomplishments, anything to make you feel less secure.
And the worst part is it can be so subtle you don't even realize it's happening until your self-esteem is in the gutter.
It's like a slow poison. Erodes your confidence over time.
So if you're in a relationship with someone who's always criticizing, what can you do?
First step, you got to recognize that it's not okay. It's not you being sensitive. Their words are hurtful, and you deserve better.
Absolutely. And that's where boundaries come in, right?
Exactly. You got to be clear that you won't tolerate being talked to like that.
And if they don't respect those boundaries, then maybe it's time to rethink the whole relationship.
You deserve to be with someone who bills you UP, not tears you down.
Okay, so hot and cold, criticism. Any other mind games we see a lot in romantic relationships?
This one's a classic. Playing the victim.
Ooh, yeah, I've definitely seen that one before.
It's when someone tries to avoid responsibility by making themselves seem like they're the one who's been wronged.
So instead of owning up to their actions, they twist it around to make it look like they're the one who's suffering.
Exactly. They may exaggerate how bad things are or blame you for everything or even accuse you of being the aggressor.
And it works because most people are naturally empathetic. So you end up feeling sorry for them.
Right. And suddenly you're the one apologizing, making excuses for them, trying to fix their problems.
Which is, of course, exactly what they wanted all along.
Yep. They've successfully shifted the focus off of themselves.
So how do you spot this one? How do you not get sucked in?
Look for the pattern. Do they ever take responsibility for their mistakes? Or is it always someone else's fault?
And are they always the one who's suffering the most?
Right. They might really play up their pain, their struggles, to get your sympathy.
Okay, so if you're dealing with a victim player, what can you do?
Recognize the game. Once you see it for what it is, it's easier to not get emotionally tangled up in it.
Don't buy into the drama. Don't let them pull you in.
Exactly. And don't feel like you have to fix their problems. That's not your job.
You're only responsible for yourself.
Right. And if they're not willing to take responsibility for their own actions, then maybe it's time to create some distance.
Okay, we've covered a lot about romantic relationships. But mind games,
Yeah.
they don't just happen there, right?
Nope. Let's talk about friendships.
Ooh, yeah. Friendships can be just as messy as romantic relationships, even if we don't always talk about it that way.
That's true. And because friendship is built on trust and closeness, those bonds can be, they can be used against you by someone who wants to manipulate.
So what are some common mind games we see in friendships?
One that comes up a lot is passive aggression.
Ah, yes. The silent treatment's best friend. Tell me more about that one.
So, passive aggression, it's basically expressing anger or resentment in a roundabout way. Not being direct, but using like subtle behaviors.
So instead of saying what's bothering them, they'll sulk, give you the silent treatment, make snide comments, or maybe even like accidentally mess up your plans.
Exactly. They're trying to get back at you or get what they want without actually having to, confront the issue.
Hmm. And it's so annoying because it's hard to even address. You ask what's wrong and they're all nothing.
Right, which leaves you feeling totally confused, anxious, like you're walking on eggshells. You keep trying to figure out what you did wrong.
Which of course is what they want you to do.
Yep. They get their needs met without having to be honest or communicate like an adult.
Okay, so dealing with a passive-aggressive friend, how do we handle that?
First, you got to spot the pattern. Once you realize it IS manipulation, you can stop taking it personally and start setting some boundaries.
So like call them out on their behavior.
You can try. You could say something like, hey, I noticed you've been kind of distant. Is something bothering you?
But what if they just deny it? Or get defensive?
Then you have a choice.
Yeah.
Keep engaging with that passive-aggressive stuff or create some distance.
It's tough to walk away from a friend, especially if you've been close for a long time.
I know, it's hard. But sometimes you got to prioritize your own well-being. You deserve friendships where people are honest and respectful.
Right. Okay, so passive aggression, check. Anything else that's common in friendships?
Another big one is guilt tripping.
We talked about that in general, but how does it look different in friendships?
Well, it could be lots of things. They might try to make you feel bad for not spending enough time with them, not being supportive enough, not putting their needs first.
So it's like emotional blackmail.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Using your guilt to get you to do what they want.
And it works, because we care about our friends, we don't want to disappoint them.
Exactly. The guilt tripper knows that, and they use it to their advantage.
Okay, so friends laying on the guilt trip, what do we do?
Same as any mind game. Recognize it. Once you see its manipulation, it's easier to not get sucked in emotionally.
So don't let them control you with guilt. Stick to your own needs and priorities.
Yep. And it's important to communicate that you won't be manipulated. You can say something like, I hear you, but I'm not going to do something I'm not comfortable with just to make you happy.
And if they keep doing it, maybe it's time to rethink the friendship.
It's tough, but sometimes it's necessary. You don't deserve to be in a friendship where you're constantly feeling guilty and walking on eggshells.
Okay, so we've done romantic relationships, friendships. Let's move on to families.
Families. Tricky territory because those dynamics can be so complicated, so deep-rooted.
Totally. You've got all that history, emotional baggage, unspoken expectations.
It can be really hard to see manipulation when it's coming from family.
So what are some of the mind games we might see in families?
One big one is emotional manipulation. It's a broad term, but it basically means using guilt, fear, or obligation to control someone.
Like guilt tripping, but on a whole other level.
Could be, yeah. But it can also involve playing on other emotions, like fear of rejection, family duty, even love and loyalty.
So, like, what are some examples? How does that actually play out in a family?
Imagine a parent who's constantly reminding their adult child of all the sacrifices they made, making them feel embedded. Or a sibling who threatens to cut you off if you don't do what they want. Or a grandparent using guilt trips, saying things like, you're breaking my heart.
Oof, those are rough.
Yeah.
And I could see how they'd be extra effective in a family because those bonds are so strong.
Exactly. It's harder to set boundaries with family because there's this sense of, obligation.
So if you're dealing with that kind of emotional manipulation from a family member, what can you do?
Recognize it for what it is. Once you see its manipulation, it's easier to separate yourself from those emotional appeals.
So don't let their guilt trips or emotional pleas control you. Stick to your own needs.
Exactly, and communicate those boundaries clearly and respectfully, just like in any other relationship.
But I imagine that's extra hard with family.
It can be. They might not be used to you setting boundaries, or they might try to guilt you into giving in.
So what if they don't respect your boundaries?
Then you might have to limit contact. Maybe even distance yourself completely.
That sounds drastic, but I guess sometimes you got to do what you got to do to protect yourself.
You're right. Family's important. but it shouldn't come at the cost of your own well-being.
Okay, so romantic relationships, friendships, families. Let's tackle the final frontier, the workplace.
Ah, yes, the workplace. Competition, ambition, and unfortunately, a whole lot of potential for manipulation.
And it feels higher stakes because your job's on the line.
Totally. The power dynamics in a workplace can be super tricky. There's a lot of pressure to, like, fit in and not make waves.
So what kind of mind games do we see in the professional world?
One that's super common is undermining. It's basically someone subtly sabotaging you, your work, your reputation.
So like passive aggression, but with your career on the line.
Exactly. It could be taking credit for your ideas, spreading rumors, excluding you from important stuff.
And it's so frustrating because it's usually done in a way that's hard to prove or confront directly.
Right. They're good at making it seem like they didn't mean it or it was an accident.
You end up feeling like you're going crazy, like, am I imagining this? Am I being too sensitive?
And that self-doubt can be really bad for your confidence, for your career overall.
Okay, so you're dealing with a coworker who's trying to undermine you. What do you do?
Recognize the pattern. Once you see it as intentional sabotage, you can start protecting yourself.
So, document everything. Keep track of every time they take credit, exclude you, or spread rumors.
Exactly. If you have solid evidence, you can go to your manager or HR.
But what if it's more subtle? What if you don't have concrete proof?
Then focus on building your own reputation. Make sure your work is visible, your contributions are recognized.
Don't let them diminish your accomplishments.
Exactly. And if it gets really bad, you might have to consider changing jobs.
Wow, that's a big step. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do for your own well-being.
You're right. Your career is important, but not at the cost of your mental health.
Okay, so undermining, check. Anything else that's common in the workplace?
We've talked about it before, but gaslighting.
We talked about it in relationships,
Yeah.
but how does gaslighting happen at work?
Lots of ways. Your boss might deny promises, question your memory of events, make you feel incompetent.
So they're trying to manipulate how you see reality to maintain their own power.
Exactly. And because of the power dynamics, it can be hard to challenge a boss who's doing this.
So you end up confused, doubting yourself, wondering if you're the problem.
Which can be really damaging to your confidence in your career.
So if your boss or a coworker is gaslighting you, what can you do?
Document everything. Keep detailed records of conversations, emails, anything where they've contradicted themselves or made you feel crazy.
So you have proof if you need to go to HR or someone.
Exactly. Also, talk to people you trust outside of work. Colleagues in other departments, mentors, friends, they can give you an objective perspective.
And if it gets too bad, maybe it's time to consider a new job, like we talked about before.
You got to prioritize your well-being.
Okay, so we've covered how mind games can show up in romantic relationships, friendships, families, and workplaces.
And the takeaway is that these tactics are everywhere. Any situation where there's power and emotions involved, you might find this stuff.
So the key is to be aware of it, recognize the patterns, and protect yourself.
Exactly. And remember, listener, you're not alone. Mind games are unfortunately pretty common, and there's help out there if you need it.
We'll be talking about some of those resources and giving more practical tips for fighting back against mind games in our next episode. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time in the dark side of human nature, all these mind games people play, relationships, families, work.
And we've talked about how important it is to be aware of it, right? See the patterns, understand the psychology of why it works.
But now let's get to the good stuff. What can people actually do about it? How do we protect ourselves from these mind games and build, good, solid relationships?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think it all comes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, self-awareness.
Yeah, because if you don't know your own weaknesses, what triggers you, what buttons people can push.
You're going to be an easy target, like walking into a battle without any armor.
So how do you even start becoming more self-aware? It sounds kind of vague.
It can be, yeah. But there are some things you can actually do. Like, think about your past relationships, times when you felt manipulated or controlled. What were the common themes? What tactics worked on you?
Ooh, good journaling exercise. Figure out your insecurities, your fears. Those things someone could use against you.
Exactly. The more you know about those vulnerabilities, the better you'll be at spotting when someone's trying to use them against you.
Like knowing the other team's playbook before the game even starts.
That's a great way to put it. And once you have that self-awareness, you can start working on, building those boundaries.
Right. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. We've said it a million times. But how do you actually set them?
It takes practice, for sure, but boundaries are basically about communicating your needs and your limits clearly and respectfully.
So, like, not letting people walk all over you, but also not shutting everyone out completely.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, protecting yourself while still being open to connection in a healthy way.
Okay, so how do we actually communicate those boundaries? Any tips?
One helpful way to think about it is needs and consequences. First, what need of yours isn't being met? Do you need to feel respected, heard, appreciated?
And then you tell them that need directly.
Right. But here's the key. You also say what will happen at a fight that need continues to be unmet.
So not just, hey, be more respectful. It's, hey, I need you to be more respectful, and if you're not, I'm going to have to distance myself from this relationship.
Perfect example. And the consequences, they gotta be something you're actually willing to do.
No empty threats. Got it. But what about when someone's like in the middle of gaslighting you? It's hard to think straight in those moments.
It is. That's why it's good to have some responses ready to go, almost like little scripts you've practiced.
Ooh, I like that. Give us some examples.
Simple things like, I hear what you're saying, but that's not my experience, or I need some time to think about this, or even just, I'm not comfortable talking about this right now.
And those are helpful because they're not arguing, just asserting your reality.
Right. Disengaging without giving them more fuel for their fire.
I love it. And listener, remember, this takes practice. Standing up to someone who's trying to control you, it's hard, especially if it's someone you care about.
It's true. But each time you set a boundary, each time you stand up for yourself, you're building that muscle, you know?
And hopefully the manipulator gets the message. Like, okay, this isn't going to work on them anymore.
That's the goal. But honestly, sometimes you can set all the boundaries in the world, communicate perfectly, and some people are just, they're going to keep playing their games.
Sadly, yeah. And when that happens, I guess there's only one thing left to do.
You're talking about walking away.
It's the hardest choice, but sometimes it's the only way to really protect yourself.
You're absolutely right. And it's not a sign of weakness, listener. Sometimes it's the strongest thing you can do.
It's taking back your power, putting your well-being first. You're not letting them use you anymore.
And when you remove yourself from that toxic situation, you make space for good things to come into your life.
And remember what we said before. Sometimes their behavior, it's not even about you. They've got their own baggage, their own issues they're dealing with.
That's so important to remember. It helps you detach from the situation and see it more objectively.
It's not personal. It's about taking care of yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's another tactic that I think is really interesting, but also like really hard to do.
What are you thinking of?
It's called gray rocking. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, gray rocking. It's often recommended for dealing with narcissists or people who are just like really good at manipulating others.
And it's basically about making yourself as boring and unreactive as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Like a gray rock.
Mm.
Dull, lifeless, completely unresponsive.
So you don't engage in their drama. You don't feed their ego. You don't give them that reaction they're looking for.
Right. You keep your answers short, factual, no emotion. Don't share anything personal. Don't argue with them. Don't let them provoke you.
It sounds incredibly hard, especially if you're used to, having a more lively reaction to things.
It's definitely challenging. But it can work because you're essentially taking away their power. They're not getting what they need from you.
And eventually, they might just get bored and move on to someone else who will, play their game.
That's the idea, yeah. But gray rocking is not a forever solution. It's more like a temporary strategy while you figure out your next move.
And it's not for every situation, right?
Yeah.
Like, if someone's being physically abusive or threatening you, that's a whole different ballgame. You need to get out of there and get help.
Absolutely. Gray rocking's a tool, but it's not a magic wand.
And listener, please remember, you don't have to go through this alone. There are resources out there, whether it's therapy, support groups, even just talking to a friend or family member you trust.
It's a sign of strength to ask for help, not weakness. It shows you're serious about taking care of yourself and getting out of that manipulation cycle.
Okay, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. Any final thoughts, anything you want to leave them with?
Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, if someone's making you feel bad or confused consistently, those are warning signs.
Don't ignore those feelings. Don't try to explain them away.
Your intuition is powerful. It's usually trying to tell you something important.
And remember, you get to choose who you let into your life and how they treat you. Choose wisely.
Choose kindness, honesty, respect.
And choose yourself. Always choose yourself.
Well said.
All right, everyone, that wraps up our deep dive into mind games. We hope this has been helpful, giving you some tools to deal with this stuff. Remember, knowledge is power, and knowing yourself is your best defense.
And never forget the power of good boundaries and the courage it takes to walk away from relationships that aren't good for you.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.